Welcome back to Zero to Hero, the podcast where we explore the incredible, true stories of people who started with absolutely nothing and achieved massive success. I'm your host, Kristen. If you listened to our previous episodes, you know we focused on basic English. Today, we are leveling up. We are going to use intermediate English. This means the sentences will be a bit more complex, and I'll introduce some more advanced vocabulary words. However, the goal remains the same, to inspire you while you improve your language skills. Today's theme is against all odds. We are going to talk about people who faced impossible situations, experienced terrible failures, and still managed to come out on top. Let's get started. The first story is about the man who sold his dog, Sylvester Stallone. Our first story is about a famous Hollywood actor and writer, Sylvester Stallone. You probably know him as Rocky or Rambo. Today, he is a global superstar. But in the early 1970s, he was a completely broke and struggling actor living in New York City. Stallone was so poor that he couldn't even afford to pay his rent or buy food. At his lowest point, he was incredibly desperate. He had a dog named Butkus, whom he loved very much. However, because he couldn't afford to feed the dog, he had to make a heartbreaking decision. He went to a local liquor store and sold his dog to a stranger for just $50. He walked away crying. 2 weeks later, Stallone was watching a boxing match on television between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner. Wepner was an unknown boxer, but he fought incredibly hard against the champion. Watching this fight gave Stallone a sudden burst of inspiration. He immediately went home and wrote the script for the movie Rocky in just 3 days. He knew he had created something special. He tried to sell the script to film studios. The studios loved the story and offered him a lot of money, up to $360,000, but there was a catch. They wanted a famous actor to play the lead role. Stallone refused. He told the studios, "I am Rocky. You can only have the script if I play the main character." He was completely broke, but he wouldn't compromise on his dream. Finally, a studio agreed to let him star in the movie, but they only paid him $35,000 for the script. Do you know what he did with that money? He tracked down the man who bought his dog. The man refused to sell the dog back for $50, so Stallone ended up paying $3,000 to get Butkus back. Rocky went on to win 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and launched Stallone into superstardom. Second story is about the ultimate late bloomer, Vera Wang. When we think of success, we often imagine young people building companies in their 20s. But our next story proves that it is never too late to completely change your life. Vera Wang is one of the most famous fashion designers in the world. If you look at high-end wedding dresses, her name is everywhere. But she didn't start designing clothes until she was 40 years old. When Vera was young, her dream had absolutely nothing to do with fashion design. She was a competitive figure skater. She trained passionately for years and hoped to make the United States Olympic team in 1968. Unfortunately, she didn't qualify. She was devastated. Her lifelong dream had been crushed. She needed to pivot, to change direction. She got a job at Vogue magazine, a highly prestigious fashion publication. She worked her way up and stayed there for 15 years. Her new dream was to become the editor-in-chief of the magazine. But once again, she faced rejection. She was passed over for the promotion. The job went to another famous fashion icon, Anna Wintour. Vera left the magazine and went to work for Ralph Lauren. A few years later, at age 39, she was preparing to get married. While shopping for her wedding, she realized that the bridal industry lacked modern, elegant dresses for mature women. She was so frustrated by the lack of options that she decided to design her own wedding dress. This sparked a brilliant idea. At age 40, an age when many people are settling into their careers, Vera Wang took a massive risk. She borrowed money from her father and opened her own bridal boutique in New York. Because of her background in fashion journalism, she knew what modern women wanted. Her designs revolutionized the bridal industry. Today, she oversees a massive lifestyle empire, proving that failure in one area can simply be preparation for success in another. Our third story is about the pursuit of happiness, Chris Gardner. Our final story today is incredibly moving. It was actually turned into a very famous movie starring Will Smith called The Pursuit of Happiness. Chris Gardner was a smart, hardworking man living in San Francisco in the early 1980s. He was trying to sell medical equipment, but the machines were too expensive and doctors didn't want to buy them. Because he wasn't making any sales, his financial situation deteriorated quickly. His wife left him, leaving Chris as a single father to his toddler son. Eventually, Chris and his young son were evicted from their apartment. Evicted means the landlord legally forces you to leave because you haven't paid the rent. They were completely homeless. They had to sleep wherever they could find shelter. Sometimes they slept in cheap motels, sometimes in parks, and heartbreakingly, they frequently slept on the floor of a public bathroom in a train station. Chris would lock the bathroom door, hold his sleeping son, and cry. Despite this horrific situation, Chris was determined to build a better life. He managed to get into a training program at a prestigious stock brokerage firm. A stockbroker buys and sells investments for clients. However, this training program was an unpaid internship. That means he worked long, stressful hours every day, but received zero salary. Furthermore, out of 20 interns, only one person would be offered a permanent job at the end of the program. During the day, Chris wore his only suit and called hundreds of potential clients, trying to outsell the other interns. He never told his coworkers that he was homeless. As soon as work finished, he would rush across the city to stand in line at a homeless shelter, hoping to get a bed for him and his son. His work ethic was unmatched. Because of his relentless determination, Chris passed his licensing exam and won the single job offer at the firm. He became a full-time, salaried stockbroker. A few years later, he started his own brokerage firm, Gardner Rich & Company, with just $10,000. He eventually sold his share in the company for millions of dollars. Today, he is a wealthy entrepreneur, author, and motivational speaker who travels the world helping others. What does Sylvester Stallone, Vera Wang, and Chris Gardner have in common? They didn't let their circumstances define their future. Stallone refused to lower his standards even when he couldn't feed his dog. Vera Wang accepted that her first two dreams failed, and she reinvented herself at 40. Chris Gardner endured the humiliation of homelessness to provide a better future for his son. When you are learning an intermediate language, you will face plateaus. A plateau is a period where you feel like you aren't improving, no matter how hard you study. You might feel frustrated. You might want to quit. During those times, remember these stories. Success rarely comes quickly, and it almost never comes easily. It requires relentless determination. Welcome back to Zero to Hero, the podcast where we explore the incredible true stories of people who started from the absolute bottom and climbed to the very top. I'm your host, Kristen. Because you guys loved our last episode so much, we are continuing with part 2 of our Against All Odds series. We are still using intermediate level English, so pay close attention to the context of the stories to learn new vocabulary. Today, we are looking at 3 more extraordinary individuals, one threw his biggest success in the garbage. One grew up in conditions so poor she had to search through trash cans for food, and one was rejected by a company only to sell his own app to them years later for billions of dollars. Let's dive right into these amazing stories. Our fourth story is about the master of horror who trashed his own book, Stephen King. This story is about one of the most famous authors in the world, Stephen King. He is known as the King of Horror and has written famous books like It, The Shining, and Misery. He has sold over 350 million copies of his books. But before he was famous, his life was completely different. In the early 1970s, Stephen King was a high school English teacher in Maine. He and his wife, Tabitha, were incredibly poor. They lived in a tiny, freezing trailer. A trailer is a mobile home, and theirs was in terrible condition. They were so financially tight that they had to disconnect their telephone because they couldn't afford the monthly bill. Sometimes they couldn't even afford to buy basic medicine for their sick children. Stephen loved writing, but he was only making a few dollars by selling short stories to magazines. He was exhausted, depressed, and starting to doubt his talent. One day, he started writing a story about a teenage girl with telekinetic powers, the ability to move objects with her mind. The girl's name was Carrie. He wrote 3 pages, read them over, and decided they were absolute garbage. Feeling frustrated and defeated, he crumpled the papers into balls and threw them into the trash can. He was ready to give up on the story entirely. But later that day, his wife, Tabitha, went to empty the trash. She saw the crumpled papers, took them out, and read them. She walked over to Stephen, handed the papers back to him, and said, "You have something here? I really think you need to finish this." Because his wife believed in him, Stephen sat back down and finished the novel. He sent the manuscript to a publishing company. A few months later, they bought the paperback rights to Carrie for $400,000. Stephen King went from not being able to afford a telephone to becoming a millionaire, all because someone else believed in the work he had thrown away. Our fifth story is about the EGOT winner who fought extreme poverty, Viola Davis. Our next story is about the breathtakingly talented actress, Viola Davis. In the entertainment industry, there is an ultimate achievement called an EGOT. It stands for Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony. Winning all 4 of these awards means you are a master of television, music, film, and theater. Viola Davis is an EGOT winner. When you see her on the red carpet in beautiful gowns, she looks like royalty. But her childhood was a daily fight for survival. Viola grew up in Rhode Island. Her family lived in what is called abject poverty. This isn't just being poor. This is a severe, extreme lack of basic human needs. The apartments her family lived in were often condemned by the city, meaning they were legally declared unsafe to live in. They had no hot water, and in the winter they often had no heat. The apartment was infested with rats. Viola has spoken openly in interviews about how the rats would eat their toys and how she had to sleep with rags tied around her neck to prevent the rats from biting her at night. The worst part, however, was the hunger. Viola was constantly starving. She was so hungry that she would steal food from the local store, or she would climb into large garbage dumpsters to search for half-eaten food thrown away by other people. But Viola found a way to escape her painful reality: school and acting. She threw herself into her education. She realized that developing her talent was her only ticket out of poverty. She worked exceptionally hard, won a scholarship to Rhode Island College, and later attended Juilliard, the most prestigious performing arts school in America. Despite facing racism and a lack of opportunities for Black women in Hollywood, Viola's raw talent and relentless drive made her undeniable. She went from searching dumpsters for food to becoming one of the most respected and decorated actors in history. And the final story is about the ultimate irony, John Coombe. Our final story today features a man named Jan Coombe. You might not recognize his name, but I can almost guarantee you have his app on your smartphone right now. Jan Coombe is the co-founder of WhatsApp. Jan was born in a small village in Ukraine when it was still part of the Soviet Union. His family lived in a house with no hot water. When Jan was 16, the political environment became dangerous, so he and his mother immigrated to the United States, settling in California. His father was supposed to join them later, but he got sick and passed away. In America, life was a massive struggle. Jan's mother worked as a babysitter, and Jan swept floors at a local grocery store to make a few dollars. They didn't have enough money for groceries, so they relied on food stamps. Food stamps are government vouchers given to poor families so they can acquire basic food at the supermarket. They would wait in long lines at the social services office to collect these vouchers, just to survive. Tragically, Jan's mother was diagnosed with cancer. Now they were surviving entirely on her disability checks. During this difficult time, Jan discovered an interest in computers. He couldn't afford university classes, so he bought used computer manuals from a local bookstore. He taught himself computer networking, read the books, and then return them to the store to get his money back. His self-taught skills got him a job as a security tester, and eventually he was hired by Yahoo. After working there for several years, he and his friend Brian Acton quit to travel. When they returned, both of them applied for jobs at a fast-growing tech company called Facebook. Facebook interviewed them both and rejected them both. Instead of getting angry, Jan noticed a new trend. Smartphones were becoming popular, and he realized there was no cheap, easy way for people to send text messages internationally. Remembering how hard and expensive it was to call his family back in Ukraine, he decided to build an app. He called it WhatsApp. The app exploded in popularity. It became the biggest messaging app in the world. A few years later, the same company that rejected Jan for a job realized they needed his app. Facebook offered to buy WhatsApp. They agreed on a price, $19 billion. When it was time to sign the final massive contract to sell the company, Jan Coombe didn't sign it in a fancy boardroom. He drove to the old social services building where he and his mother used to stand in line for food stamps. He signed the billion-dollar contract right on the door of the welfare office. What incredible stories. Stephen King showed us that we are sometimes our own worst critics. Viola Davis taught us that our background does not have to determine our destination. And Jan Coombe proved that a rejection today might just be setting you up for a multi-billion-dollar victory tomorrow. If you are learning English, you are also on a journey. You might feel like Stephen King, wanting to throw your notebook in the trash when the grammar gets too hard. You might feel rejected when you make a mistake speaking. But remember, every expert was once a beginner. Keep practicing, keep listening, and keep pushing forward. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of our Go Against All Odds series on the Zero to Hero podcast. I'm Kristen. Have a fantastic day and keep learning.